So this is Dr. Todd Shaw's POLI 201 American National Government course, and this is a lecture for that course on the topic of, or for the section of the practice of American citizenship. You'll remember from last time class, I had with section 2, or the previous section, we talked about how we shape citizenship through laws such as civil rights and civil liberties. Now we're going to talk about how do Americans actually practice their notions of citizenship through various means. And in this particular lecture, we'll talk about how ideology and public opinion, or public opinion and ideology, affect the thinking of Americans. In what ways do our values that shape our attitudes and our ideology, which I'll explain the distinction between the two, have an impact upon our political behavior, upon those things that we do as an outcome of our thinking and our beliefs. So, true for every lecture, I want to begin with an opening story, and often I have decided to use a topical issue. It is American politics, so we can talk about a topical issue that has direct bearing upon what we're discussing in a specific section. And most recently, former President Barack Obama and former President George W. Bush made very impactful speeches. One was a campaign speech by Obama for a gubernatorial candidate in Virginia who he supports as a Democratic candidate. And the other instance was President George W. Bush, making a speech at the George W. Bush Institute, where he was making sort of a statesman speech, a reflective speech as to where things stand in American politics. I would argue in both of these speeches, these men were trying to subtly or not so subtly influence public opinion, what people thought, in order to, or the beliefs or attitudes that people walk away with, in order to in some way impact their behavior, their political behavior, and in ways in which they relate to each other. And in particular, both of these men expressed a concern about the problem of polarization, of the ways in which Americans are pulling apart, pulling in opposite directions, that make sort of the collective action problem a real problem in American politics. Let me just sort of play a clip from a CNN broadcast by Anderson Cooper, who's, as you know, is a journalist and media commentator, and then I'll move on. And this clip is about the two speeches, the two contrasting speeches.
My target for retirement, income for life. Yeah, you want to keep getting a check every month. It's a no-brainer.
If only we were born knowing how to retire.
Let me skip there.
It's breaking news. Former President Obama just wrapped up a campaign speech on behalf of the Democratic candidate for governor of Virginia, and in it, he assailed the direction of politics in this country. Here's part of what he said.
Instead of our politics reflecting our values, we've got politics infecting our communities. Instead of looking for ways to work together and get things done in a practical way, we've got folks who are deliberately trying to make folks angry, to demonize people who have different ideas, to get the base all riled up because it provides a short-term tactical advantage.
Well, he wasn't the only member of the President's Club to speak out today. Former President George W. Bush offered a point-by-point takedown of Trumpism in a speech in New York this morning.
We've seen our discourse degraded by casual cruelty. At times, it can seem like the forces pulling us apart are stronger than the forces binding us together. Argument turns too easily into animosity. Disagreement escalates into dehumanization. We've seen nationalism distorted into nativism. We've forgotten the dynamism that immigration has always brought to America.
Well, joining me now, Scott Jennings, former special assistant to President George W. Bush, and Jen Psaki, former White House communications director and deputy press secretary under President Obama. Scott, were you surprised to hear President Bush coming out so forcefully today? I mean, he didn't mention President Trump by name, but I mean, the implication was clear.
I did not. I was not surprised he made these comments, because this is the same decent, civil, dedicated to public service George W. Bush that I've always known and that we've always known in the Republican Party. So I wasn't surprised to hear him espouse his views on politics in this country and on policy. He was as consistent in his views today as I think he was when he ran for president and got elected.
He's been very careful, though. You know, with President Obama, he was very careful not to sort of publicly criticize things he would have disagreed with about them.
And he didn't mention Donald Trump by name today. And look, I don't think the concept of us unraveling a bit in our politics started with Donald Trump. I think we've been unraveling over a number of years. I mean, I think there's a sense right now that we don't understand each other. We have an urban-rural divide that I think is plaguing our politics, and we have a seeming inability to disagree with each other without hating each other. And I think this has been unraveling over several years, and I think President Bush has been watching this, and that's what he was talking about today. And I think Barack Obama knows it too, and I think these two guys are pleading with the country. We have to pull ourselves together because we're Americans. We're all in this together.
I assume it was just coincidence that they happened to be speaking out on the same day. But Jen, what did you think of what you heard from President Obama?
Well, yeah, it was definitely a coincidence, but I think it tells you a lot that you have the two former presidents of the United States who most recently sat in the Oval Office giving what were not complicated sets of remarks. Really, they were about human decency. They were about finding what unites us and not what divides us. And these are themes President Obama has been talking about since he ran for office, and President Bush has also been talking about for quite some time. So what struck me was, in a week where we have been arguing about whether or not these past presidents called military families, they stood up today, and I think what they were really saying was, this is not normal, and we all need to rise above this. It's not just about President Trump, it's about all of you, elected officials, it's about people who are public servants, and we need to recognize this is not normal what we're seeing from the Oval Office.
It is. I mean,
now I'm going to stop it there, but you can continue to watch that clip or other related clips. Forgive me if it was a little bit off the screen, but I wanted to at least show you a decent portion of those particular clips. But again, this idea of polarization, we're going to get back to it. In what ways is there a democratic collective action problem in America of being able to create a coalition that can move us forward on critical issues? And how does polarization, pulling apart, literally sitting on opposite sides of any question, no matter what the issue, presents a problem for American democracy? We'll discuss that in our next section a bit further. So, you know, I always want to begin with the principles of politics. I want to always come back to the Lowy et al. Et al. Meaning others, the Lowy et al. Discussion of our framework. So we have at least three principles in mind in this section. The rationality principle: there's a wide range of interest at stake in any question that the government and different groups must decide in what must be done, what ought to be done. So what's in the rational self-interest of individuals? What's in the rational self-interest of government actors? And in what ways does their political values and thinking, which of course is pivotal, shape their, what they think ought to be done? How does ideology serve as a lens? As we'll talk about, how do we see issues through the lens of how we view the world, our worldview? We'll get back to that. Then the policy principle: politicians follow public opinion as part of the representative process. If we're a democratic republic, if we're a representative democracy, we have to have input from the people. There must be the consent of the governed. Well, how do the governors think about what the governed seek, particularly when they have to think about policy stances and electoral chances? In what ways am I not going to get elected if I take this view? What do the public opinion polls tell me and help me think about as to what I should do? What should I do in voting for this bill or not voting for this bill? In what ways does that impact my chances of election or re-election? And then the collective action problem. And this is, and public opinion and ideology present us with the sort of larger public collective action. Politicians and groups try to shape public opinion in order to set the agenda and to build policy coalitions. So these are at least three broader considerations of what occurs relative to public opinion and ideology. All right, so in this lecture, I wanted you to understand how public opinion and ideology are shaped and how they matter in American politics. And want to do this first by talking about the concept of political knowledge. What do we know? What's the baseline of what we know and understand about politics? How informed are we in order to come to certain political assessments or judgments? And we'll do an exercise in class that reflects this broader issue or question. Then we'll talk directly about public opinion and ideology. And then we'll talk about, well, how do we measure this concept of public opinion and ideology? How do we know that's what people think? How do we know where people stand? What's the science of survey methods, of survey research that reveals to us these issues? And how do we sometimes either misinterpret or get it wrong? Very critical in this past election, as we'll discuss. I have a cartoon I'll share with you to illustrate the point further about how tapping into these polls and tapping into these outcomes may impact or trying to poll public opinion has an impact on behavior, on what people do collectively and individually. A wife was saying to a husband as he was putting on his coat, about to leave, I think about to go out and vote. He says, "You don't have to vote, Sam. The networks predicted the winner 3 hours ago." So in other words, why vote now if a prediction's already been made based upon what polls and exit polls have told us? This could be a real problem in some respects if people are discouraged from voting because they believe, they've already told me who the winner's going to be. What's the point of me voting? So you can see how this could be a bit of a vicious cycle here. Okay, now I'm showing you here a chart, and it comes from the work of Delhi Carpini, and we'll talk more about Delhi and Carpini and Ketter's work, where they, in their I think it's 1989 book, very adeptly tapped into American public opinion and political knowledge. And what they show in this graphic, this is a compilation of political knowledge questions from various sources, including the Roper Center, the National Election Study, the 1989 Survey of Political Knowledge, and other miscellaneous surveys. And each asterisk, each star, represents 1% of survey questions. So what they did is they asked questions about political institutions and processes. You know, who's the in other words, are there 3 branches of government? And what are the 3 branches of government? And how does Congress pass a law? Peoples and players. Can you identify the president of the United States? Most people, the vast majority of people can. But can you identify the vice president? Can you identify, do you know who is the Secretary of State? So do you know the Speaker of the House, the name of in the party of the Speaker of the House? So how much do people know about people and players when you ask them these questions on polls? Then can they say something about domestic politics? Do they know? Can they get it right when you ask them about a particular bill? What's before Congress now in terms of tax reform? Do you know what the Republican majority is pushing with regards to tax reform? Do you know something about foreign affairs? What happened recently with these soldiers who were killed, I believe, in Chad? Do you know what's happening most recently in Iraq or Israel? And then general sort of political knowledge, sort of all those other questions not sort of covered by these particular categories. Well, the greater majority of people, or that's probably not the right way to say it, but sort of the median value, these median values are the middle values. So if you were to rank them and look across the higher median values, more people can talk about institutions and processes. So it's easier to say, because those things don't change, right? It's sort of, the Constitution rarely, if ever, changes in our lifetime. And so the framework itself doesn't change. Rules frequently Some rules certainly may change, but the broad rules don't change. And so there are still three branches of government now and will be in the foreseeable future. And the Speaker of the House is elected by the majority in Congress as a rule of Congress. So those things don't change. But players change a little bit more. And so you have fewer people kind of being able to name the players, at least if you take these medians as indication. They know something. It's kind of interesting because, at least in this survey, people may have known a little more about foreign affairs than they did about domestic politics. Interesting, no doubt. But also, they have a little bit more general political knowledge if you compare it to domestic politics. So these medians are, I'm not saying that exactly right, but but it does kind of give some sense about what people know. How are they politically informed and what different categories of knowledge matter? So let's talk a little bit more about political knowledge. Now, so let me define it. It is the basic information we have to support our political views and to inform our decisions. Should we not know certain things in order to be informed voters? This goes back to a perennial concern of the framers about, well, would the masses of democracy really be informed enough to elect a president of the United States? Don't we need an electoral college to serve as a mediating institution between what people really kind of understand broadly and what they don't understand broadly? And so political knowledge has been a perennial concern, an ongoing concern, in other words, in American democracy. Like I said, with Daly, Carpini, and Ketter, they discovered that political knowledge has really not changed that much over 40 years, though interest can vary by group. So what we know, the broad categories of how people understand and navigate these categories, people for the most part, have about the same amount of political knowledge because of the nature of the information, right? Certain information changes rapidly. Other information doesn't change rapidly at all. And so maybe the nature of the knowledge doesn't change per se, but how groups look at that knowledge, what are their various views or self-interest may change. And so political trust as a concept matters, and we're going to get into political trust. How much do you trust those in Washington to do what's right? That is an ongoing question on surveys, and it's been an ongoing question since the late 1940s, early 1950s. So let me give you a little bit of information we've found by way of surveys, and these are simply questions about what the public knew, let's say in 2011. So we have a little bit of hindsight. So did people know about the No Child Left Behind law? 80% of them did. Did they know what job that Hillary Clinton held as Secretary of State? Yes, 73%. Did they know Muammar Gaddafi? What leader was he the country of? Libya. Did they know what was occurring in Wisconsin? What was the nature of the Wisconsin protests? Well, 63% knew that. But when you get down, let's go down to the other side. Let's get down to the questions that people knew less about, or majority, I should say, knew less about. Government spends most on what area of spending? Only 29% of people knew it was Medicare. Representatives have a majority in which of the institutions? The House, 39%. The percent of Americans who are obese. Only 25% of Americans knew that. And then most U.S. electricity comes from what source? Only 40% could say coal. Who was the Speaker of the House? At that time, it was John Boehner. More, I would suspect that only that same amount knows that Paul Ryan now, 43%. So across these categories of knowledge, they might sort of correlate back to that graphic I showed you earlier about how institutions may be easier to know. Certain elements of foreign and domestic policy are easier to know, but other things are not. And these are individual questions, whereas the graphic I showed you earlier was about a wide range of questions, not just individual questions. So if they don't correlate in some ways, that's because This is a much smaller slice of what that previous graphic was showing you. How about Boehner? When they were asking about the Speaker of the House at the time, John Boehner, as an unfamiliar figure. Boehner is Speaker. Representatives who have representatives who have a House majority, or who's the majority in the House. I'm sorry, and Republicans being the majority in the House. So 18 to 29-year-olds knew it less than the 30 to 49-year-olds who knew it less than 50-year-olds, 50 plus. Those with college levels, levels of education knew it less. Republicans and Democrats knew these questions roughly about the same, so it didn't differ that. I'm sorry. Republicans, about 50% of Republicans knew that Boehner was a speaker. Boehner was a Republican or is a Republican. They knew that the Republicans had a majority in the House. In some ways, when one's own party is the party in power, you may know and track what's happening in that branch of government more directly. Democrats knew it less and Republicans knew it less with regards to Boehner being the speaker, or that Republicans have a majority in the House. Democrats at that particular time were not the majority in the House, and did not have a member of their party as Speaker of the House, the leader of the House of Representatives. So they knew it less self-interest in knowing. Or at least that's the perception. Let me put it that way. Okay, then let's get to the question of trust in government. And a lot can be said with regards to trust in government. This graphic is showing you how it has declined from 1958 to 2010. I may have shown you a graphic earlier about this question of trust in government. But how have various political events had a direct bearing upon trust in government? How government has responded to or been a part of various political events, and how those political events, those policy issues have shaped our perception of responsiveness to us as people, that they are most like us, or they're most likely to do what we think is right in Washington. So in this particular graphic, and this comes from a wide range of surveys, but in this particular graphics, this blue line is showing you the just about always or most of the time. So how much of the time do you trust the government in Washington to do what is right? Just about always, most of the time, or only some of the time. So this graphic kind of represents that percentage versus none of the time, or no, I don't trust government. So back in the late 50s into the early 1960s, there was high trust in government. And then there became sort of various divisions that emerged with regards to various political and social movements. So the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War protest, so you began to see trust in government decline over the 1960s. 1960s was a fractious decade where there were pushing of group rights, but there was also opposition to these expansion of rights in some corners. And so there was this sort of political tug of war that occurred, and trust in government declined as a result. And you also had the Watergate scandal under the Nixon administration. Trust in government took a further hit by way of Watergate. It increased in the early 1980s, the Ronald Reagan period, but by Reagan's mid-year, it began to decline again, possibly the Iran-Contra scandal, and we could talk more about that scandal. But maybe that had some impact. There was a real bumpy ride during the Clinton presidency, partly during the beginning part of the Bush era. But of course, 9/11, where there was a rally around the flag effect for President Bush and for government because of those, terrible attacks upon American soil. And that's not a particular unique outcome. Americans rally around the flag when there is this effect of war or external threat or attack. And so trust in government greatly increased. But over the Obama presidency, and then we can look further into over the Bush presidency, particularly by mid 2004, Hurricane Katrina and the government response, or the not effective response to Hurricane Katrina, took a real battering. There was a real battering of trust in government as a result, and then into the Obama presidency, and we could extend this further into the Trump presidency. Those levels of trust are quite low and declining. So this is some idea about how political events shape trust in government, and over the years how it has declined from very high peaks, given this back and forth of responsiveness to these political issues and events. So, what is public opinion and ideology? Let's break down a few important terms. Let's start with the most basic unit of public opinion, which are attitudes. Attitudes are individual sentiments or conclusions about political events, personalities, and or institutions. So attitudes are sort of the basic building block of public opinion. What do you think on an issue? What is your opinion or attitude on a particular issue? And there's many things that, of course, can inform your attitudes, but what is that basic attitude? Then public opinion includes the various attitudes or views or views large communities of people hold about politics and the actions of government. So you're sort of collecting all these attitudes into a broader distribution of thinking. In other words, another way to see this is public opinion is the universe of all political attitudes. So when we're measuring and studying public opinion, we're trying to say, okay, if you aggregate, if you collect all these attitudes from individuals into a broader constellation, a broader group, a broader collective, where do things sit? Where's the majority of people sit relative to their thinking? Then political ideology. So now you have your attitude, you got the broader universe of public opinion, but what's the filter that determines, or I use the notion of lens, and I'm not the first one to say that, by the way, but what's the filter or lens that individuals use to sort through things? How do they come to the opinions that they do? That's where political ideology comes in. Political ideology entails attitudes arranged into specific or systematic ways that justify interpretations of what is in an individual or a community's best interest. Political ideology tells me or gives me clues as to what I should pay attention to and what should I interpret. So when people use the labels of moderate or liberal or conservative, liberal being those individuals who are more likely to believe in expansive activist government that gets directly involved. Conservative being those who believe that you should have more limited government, some constraints or controls on government, or greater constraints or controls on government, broadly speaking. Liberals and conservatives can believe in activist government or limited government in various ways, but how expansive government should be, how limited government should be is one broad set of definitions to liberal and conservative. And then moderates are somewhere in the middle, right? But these are the labels that people either assume or they coincide with these labels in their thinking. Now, one can be conservative on social issues. One might be self-identify as a person who does not believe in abortion. You have concerns about or you believe that all life is sacred, and you don't believe that abortion should be legal or subsidized by government. But you can also believe in universal health care. You might have actually supported the Obama effort, broadly speaking. So it's not, people don't have to be hobgoblins of consistency. Their attitudes can be arranged in various ways, but these broad labels may provide some level of consistency in terms of their thinking. And there are gaps and divides, right? Gaps and divides because people use not only their ideology is informed by their sense of identity, of who they are, what are their self-interests. So gaps and divides exist in the background characteristics such as social class or gender or ethnicity or even marriage. They give us different sort of self-interest calculations. We believe that this is in our self-interest, maybe as individuals, we certainly may believe that, but we might also say as a member of the middle class, the middle class is getting hammered. Or we as a Latino community believe that we have concerns around immigration. So group membership can implicitly or explicitly matter and create ways in which people come together, but also how people divide on issues. Okay, so what do different groups believe? Let's take sort of the effect of income on political orientation. And I'll tell you, class, in this lecture, I'm going to give you sort of several graphics to portray or to illustrate what I'm saying. So just sort of take note of the bottom line as you're taking notes of what I'm telling you in each graphic. But the effect of income on political participation. And I know this is a little bit blurry, but it's asking the question coming from the General Social Survey of 2008. People themselves, rather than the government, are responsible for improving the standard of living of poor Americans. So the poor should lift themselves up by their own bootstraps. Or their health care will be worse under the new health care plan. Do I believe that the Obamacare plan would produce worse health care outcomes for myself? There is a sort of direct relationship between income and responding to this question. We call this sort of a monotonic, all in one direction relationship, where the greater your income from top earners to lower income owners, lowest income earners. So those who have the most or have the highest levels of income are less likely to believe that government should be activist, at least on this question, should be activist in terms of alleviating what's occurring with the poor. And they were more likely to believe that the Obama healthcare plan was not in their interest. This is just one slice of various slices we could take, but this is one way to look at how self-interest affects political orientations or particular attitudes. Here's another one, and it's the divide around gender. And there is a fairly consistent divide or what we call the gender gap as to how persons who self-identify as women versus men answer certain policy questions. And as this graphic is showing, the distance is what we call the gender gap. In fact, on political ideology, when you ask, do you identify as more conservative or more liberal? And we look from the late 1970s up until, this goes up until 2009, we see this persistent sort of gap where women are more likely to identify as liberal than when compared to men. And we can talk about how does gender socialization matter? How are women socialized in certain ways? What's the political learning that occurs for women that shapes their views, their perceptions of their community, and their perceptions of family, and their perceptions of political elites? Why are women more liberal than men? May be rooted in how women are socialized, are taught to believe that there is a need for more activist government as compared to men believing that there's less need of an activist government. A lot that we can delve into in that difference, but let's talk a little further about that difference in this way. This is a disagreement among men and women on issues of war and peace, and there are persistent differences between men and women that lead to a host of slight to larger differences around policy attitudes. So remember, I just showed you the graphic about political ideology, so it might relate to why there is this, across this range of questions that went from 1991 to 1999, across various polls, including the Gallup poll, but the Washington Post, a cooperative congressional election study, etc., Langer research, etc., that men, when asked sending U.S. troops to fight the Islamic militants in Iraq and Syria, 52% of men agreed to that question, only 41% of women. Support U.S. missile strikes against Syria, 2013, 53% of men agreed, 30% of women. U.S. troops to attack a terrorist camp in 2012, 71 versus 55, with support withdrawal troops from Iraq, 70% of men, 52% of women. Use U.S. troops to intervene in the genocide or civil war, 53% of men, 42% of women, and on and on and on. Why these distinctions? Do men and women think differently about war, given they have a different orientation about who's affected by war? Yes, men believe in more military intervention. More men comprise the military, comprise the armed forces. Women consider the impact of casualties upon communities and the impact of casualties upon families and upon themselves. So maybe different perceptions of self-interest also quite matter between men and women as they're answering various policy questions. And thus think about this impacts the filter that they use in interpreting these outcomes. Now, another point we can make beyond sort of gender differences are differences around questions of sexual orientation, and not just sort of difference of sexual orientation, but the contact folk have with regards to persons who self-identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And we've seen somewhat of a sea change, as that word is used, that concept is used, from the 1990s to now 2015, where you now have a majority of Americans, and these graphics are coming from your textbook, a majority of Americans supporting same-sex marriage in 2015. So you have nearly 60% of Americans supporting this in 2015, when not that long ago, roughly about 20 years ago, you had a barely less than a third of Americans supporting same-sex marriage. Excuse me, being in favor of same-sex marriage. So this is a pretty wide shift in 20 years. And you could see this shift true across other policy dimensions, but this is just on the question of same-sex marriage. Why? Contact may matter. Because LGBTQ communities have been more vocal, their social movements have given greater visibility. There's a greater visibility of gay and lesbian people in television and media across various ranges. Various stars have come out and been public about their orientation. And that's also prompted individual Americans to come out to family, to friends. So you have more Americans being aware of and in contact with persons who are gay or lesbian. So contact matters in this regard. So Americans' views towards same-sex marriage have changed in direct correlation to the number of Americans who had, the direct correlation to the number of Americans who have had direct personal contact with persons who are LGBT. Contacting matter here. And so this is yet another way where group differences matter. Identity has changed, and identity has affected the views of others and shifted the views of others. Another difference, and let's talk about, we'll talk more about ethnicity later on, but let's talk about race, and I'll give you the distinction I'm making between those two. But one way in which another sort of group, a group belonging is may matter, a group identity may matter, is along the issue of perceptions or self-identification with regards to race. When we answer those questions on the census about do you self-identify as African American or white or Asian American or Native American or Latino, those identities, how do those things matter in politics? So what's kind of really kind of is intriguing, but I'll just sort of say also can be a bit disheartening, is that some of these differences don't seem to be the closing in some regards, that there are still these persistent differences, particularly if you ask these questions of persons who self-identify as black versus or African American versus white and or European American. So the authors looked at the question of, do blacks have as good a chance as whites in your community to get any kind of job for which they are qualified? 74% of whites said yes, but only 25%, only 40% of blacks said yes. So that's a pretty wide gap there. in terms of yes and those who answered yes, and the no is a mirror image of the yes. 25% said no, 69 or almost 60% of blacks said no. 25% of whites no, 60% of blacks no. Want to make sure I said that right. Then, do black children have as good a chance as white children in your community to get a good education? 80% of whites, 55% of blacks, so there's still a majority, but there is still some gap still in the majority view in terms of quality education. Is the American justice system biased against black people? The Black Lives Matter movement may be having a direct impact on some of the thinking with regards to these polls, and this was taken in 2014. 25% of whites says yes. 68% of blacks say yes, it is biased. 69% of whites said no, it's not biased. 26% of blacks says yes. So particularly if you're talking about the impact upon groups, there can be sort of very direct distance around these questions. And as we said in our last unit class, we know that the issues around civil rights, around racial equality is still a very contentious set of issues. And so your authors introduced the notion of identity politics in this chapter, or is the degree to which person's responses are linked to their implicit or explicit sense of belonging to a different group. So group membership, whether we think about it directly or indirectly, whether it's on the front of our mind or it shapes our thinking in ways we aren't directly referencing, can matter. And fortunately or unfortunately, race still is a way in which people are divided in America. And we'll get to toward the end of this class, I'll talk about young people, because there are ways in which the younger generation is not quite as divided as is true of the older generation. But still, these are issues that shape the differing opinions, or their identities that shape different opinions. Okay, let's move on. Political socialization. So I referenced this term, particularly when talking about gender, but I'm going to talk about the term more broadly. And I'm giving you this sort of Norman Rockwell painting, or image of the painting of sort of the idyllic version of sitting down to a Thanksgiving dinner or to a family dinner where ma or grandma prepared the dinner and granddad sort of slices up the turkey and everyone's gathered around the table, and they're all are expected to attend, and it's the whole family in attendance. Sort of that idyllic, sort of traditional notion of the family dinner versus, mom and dad are very busy. So they went out to KFC to get a bucket of chicken. Little brother is a little distracted because he's sitting there texting. The family dogs have joined the conversation, of course. And an older brother really doesn't want to be there. He'd rather be on his computer or out playing video games or doing something else. And so in what ways how families are changing, are shaping the process of political socialization? Because political socialization is the process by which we learn our political orientations and allegiances. We don't get our political views by ourselves. Political views are shaped in community. We may not think about it, but there are direct and indirect ways our parents or our guardians or our family and community may shape our thinking. Now, we may disagree with their thinking. We may stand in contrast to their thinking, but we're still aware of their thinking and the values that they're trying to transmit to us. And in that transmission impact how we see things politically. Now, and so there are various, as sociologists would say, factors of socialization. There are institutions that shape our political learning, how we learn and become who we are politically in our thinking. They can include the family, they can include schools and education, certainly political and social events, which leads to a sort of political generations. We talk about this idea of political and social events. What were those traumatic or significant events that happened in our own lives that directly impact our own thinking and create what's called a cohort effect? by virtue of the fact that you went through this experience together. It shaped your thinking together. Grandparents or great-grandparents being part of what's been called the greatest generation. They were shaped by World War II and all that occurred in World War II. Or they were shaped by the Great Depression. That these political and social and economic events had direct impact upon their thinking as a generation and their orientation toward the world. So what affects your generation of roughly folk who are 18 to 24? I'm going to ask you this question. Do you think 9/11 and the attacks of 9/11 impact your thinking? Do you think the election of Barack Obama as president of the United States impact your thinking? Do you think the Great Recession affects your generation most? Do you think Trump's election most will impact your thinking as you go ahead, as you proceed ahead as adults? Or is it some other event? I'll ask you that question. So let's think about ideology. Remember that sort of notion of a systematic lens or filter. And I say lens or filter or window because you're literally looking at the world through this lens. This lens shapes what you see and what you focus upon and how things come into perspective. So ideology correlates with religion and party ID. In other words, when you say you're more conservative or more liberal, there are ways in which this directly relates to your party affiliations and how these party affiliations also relate to one's sense of where you stand religiously. So those who are Protestant overall are more likely to see in the United States are more likely to identify as conservative. Those who are Catholic lean more conservative across a range of issues. Those who self-identify as Jewish are much more likely to see themselves and to ideologically, from liberal to conservative, lean or identify as liberal or quite liberal. Those who are Muslim lean slightly conservative. And those who have no affiliations, or the nuns, no religious affiliation at all, are more likely to be or self-identify as liberal. How does this relate to party identification? By a small margin, Protestants lean more toward the Republican Party. Catholics lean more toward the Democratic Party. But remember now, Catholics also self-identify as conservative, or, here comes the question, do they lean conservative? They may say they're conservative, but what are their actual views across a range of questions? Although we know that the Catholic Church does teach its own teachings and beliefs are against the practice of abortion. So that is a central question for Catholics, as is the death penalty. The church also is against the death penalty. So in what ways this correlates or doesn't correlate with conservative or liberal views? Those who self-identify as Jewish, very strongly lean toward the Democratic Party. Those who are Muslim lean Democratic. Those who are none lean Democratic. So we'll unpack this more, but religion or religiosity relate both to ideology and to party affiliations in interesting ways. All right, now let's talk about measuring public opinion, because we can talk about what is public opinion, where people stand, what do they know by way of political knowledge, but how do we know that's what they know? How do we know that's what they think? So there's a beauty to public opinion polls, and there are problems with public opinion polls, and I want to make you an informed viewer, an informed observer when you read and see various polls. Not to simply say, they're all crap. they in famous words of Mark Twain, they're all based on statistics, and you have excuse the use of these words, but lies, damn lies, and statistics. It's all bunk. None of it's, you don't have any of it right. Don't want you to have that view, or to have the sort of halo effect that, because the poll says it, it must be absolutely true. I want you to be an informed viewer of polls. So various types of polls and surveys attempt to measure public opinion based on a scientific principle of scientific random sampling. Scientific random sampling is simply the principle that says, I have a statistical means to approximate what the entire population may believe on an issue, based on just taking a sample of the population. We could, in a course on research methods and statistics, we could talk about the central tendency theorem. We could talk about in what ways, as you increase the sample size, it approximates up to some point what the entire population believes, if you use a random principle that says everyone in the population, or in the population I'm defining, had an equal chance of being selected. So I'm randomly selected beans out of the jelly jar, and that random selection of those beans out of a jelly jar, even though I'm taking only a small sample of jelly beans, means that I could approximate what the colors of the jelly beans in the entire jar just by way of that sample. We can talk about that more, but it's important to keep in mind that this is a statistical process. It's a mathematical question, and that there can always be error or bias. It's scientific, but that doesn't mean that there's not bias or problems that we as consumers have to be mindful of. And now, there have been great improvements since 1952. In 1952, because of the selection bias problem, that they were taking a poll for who would be president of the United States, and they were only selecting individuals who had a telephone, and there were large swaths of Americans who did not have a telephone. Then they predicted, the public opinion polls predicted, and thus the newspapers put out, that Thomas Dewey, the Republican candidate, defeated Harry Truman. It's a wrap. It's done. Harry Truman is not going to be elected or re-elected president of the United States. Truman holds up this paper when he, by a significant majority, both by the electoral and popular vote, wins the election. That's because the poll was wrong. And so the Dewey defeats Truman newspaper headline became a banner example of bias in polls. So we've improved our polling greatly since then. Our polling and our survey methods and our technology have greatly improved. There are still maybe some cell phone issues, but we've even gotten around the issues of cell phones versus landlines. A great number of Americans don't use landlines anymore. They're using cell phones. We have found methods to get around that. And we've also created survey experiments that have also expanded our understanding. So the science of polling has greatly improved, but there's still bias. And I want to talk to you about that bias. So here is, and I think this is a great graphic, here is your authors compiling all of the, let me not say all, but many of the significant polls taken for the 2016 election and the accuracy of those final pre-election polls. Here's the actual vote margin for Donald Trump. What was the actual margin in terms of the popular vote, the electoral vote? What was the actual margin of the amount let me back up and say this. What was the actual reported number in terms of Donald Trump's outcome? What was the actual outcome versus what did the polls predict? That's the best way of saying it. What was the actual outcome versus what the polls predict? And this is still a margin of error. So you got some polls like the LA Times polls that put Clinton up by significant numbers that were, inaccurate. They were wrong. But you had polls like the Marvis Marketing, IBD, TIPP, and the Rasmussen poll that got closer. But either you got the LA Times poll over way on this side predicting Clinton's victory versus the GKF poll being really off by virtue of predicting this largely or this enormous loss for Clinton and enormous win for Trump. Here's where the actual margin fell. So here's what I want you to keep in mind, class. When you read these polls, keep in mind the concept of the confidence interval. If you hear a confidence interval simply says that this is a statistical prediction of what's the range of the likely outcome. We're going to put a plus or minus on how close we may be. What's the error we may have in our prediction? Plus or minus 3%, or plus or minus 4% sometimes. So that's the confidence interval. If you hear a commentator say, so-and-so is up by 1 point, so-and-so is up by 2 points, don't take that as being quite scientific, because you can't be up by 1 point if the confidence interval is 3% plus or minus. So there's always, keep in mind that simply means they might be dead even. We can't quite tell. And polls are about probability. What's the likelihood of something happening? We only know the truth once the actual real poll, the election, has occurred. So there's problems of interpretation. Opinion polling is a science, but it's very important to keep in mind it's based on probability sampling. We're sampling, we're taking a sample of the population, of the distribution of the population of possible attitudes of public opinion, and we're trying to use that sample to come up with some predictions of where people actually stand. It's an approximation. Surveyors are trying to approximate the views of a larger population based on the views of a sample of a smaller population. Random digit dialing is a process where we use telephone technologies, or we call people on the telephone. And the people who we call, we don't have a list of people. It's a program, a computer that has a set of characteristics it needs to think through in order to say, okay, in order to take this sample and make it a random sample that everyone in the population has an equal chance of being selected, given some other criteria, I'm going to randomly generate numbers to call. And so the programs randomly generate these numbers, and that's who gets called, based on, again, some characteristics, some criteria. That's the process of random digit dialing. Even given all this science, here's a couple of problems. One, selection bias, the over or underrepresentation of certain views in a survey. So if, in fact, I say I'm going to sample in the state of Michigan, and I'm only going to sample, and most of the people I sample are outside the city of Detroit. Detroit's the largest city of the state of Michigan, but it's also a heavily Democratic-leaning city. If I'm going to sample, most of my sample comes outside of Detroit, or Detroit is underrepresented, then I'm going to underrepresent the liberal or Democratic view in my poll of the general population. And you can say the reverse would be true if you focus on Detroit, as likely what happened with the Clinton forces. You focus some on Detroit, not much as they had hoped they would, but you focus some on Detroit, but you don't focus on the rest of the state of Michigan, and you lose the state of Michigan because you're oversampling in one versus another population. So that's the selection bias. The sampling error is a sampling size being too small. If you don't draw the correct sample size, it's not representative of the larger population. I cannot represent the views of 40 or 400 million people using 100 people. Now, I know it sounds kind of strange. You say, well, how does 1,000 people represent that view? Well, there is actually, again, some statistical properties that guarantees a greater likelihood that you will get closer to that actual opinion. And actually, statistically speaking, 1,000 is much bigger than 100. So, but again, if your sample is not large enough, if your sample is not representative in this sense, then you can have sampling error. You simply sampled too small of a group of people. Or you could have sampled incorrectly, or the criteria you used were incorrect in order to come up with a more representative view. So those are two biases, or two problems. A third problem is maybe the question you asked was problematic or ambiguous. Let me give you a couple of examples from your text, and then I'll give you another example. The AP reported classified information. So this is a question that was asked by the Pew Research Center. And sometimes we do these experiments to see if, in fact, Is our question leading? Is it biased? Is it giving people a particular slant when we ask them these questions? So the AP reported classified information about U.S. terrorism efforts, and prosecutors have obtained AP's phone records through a court order. Do you think this action by the federal prosecutor is or is not justified? So 52% of Americans said it was justified, 33% says it was not, and 15% had no opinion. Now, when you give people more information, how does that shape their view? So, as you have heard, the U.S. Justice Department secretly seized extensive telephone records of calls on both work and personal phones for reports and editors working for the Associated Press in the spring of 2012. Now, that's a lot more information, and there are some interesting words in that information. At the time, the news organizations using government leaks had broken a story about an international terrorist plot. The government obtained the phone records without giving the news organizations prior notice, as is customary. Wow, more information, right? Do you think the government was probably justified in taking these actions, or does this sound more like the government went too far? Now, that is a leading question. You're not asking people in an unbiased, what do you simply think fashion. You are using language that's leading. That flips the percentages by a wide margin. 31% said justified, but 60% says, no, friend, that is not justified. Well, the more you lead, the more you're likely to be able to produce a certain outcome by leading people in that regard. And so measurement error is another error. There can also be the problem of bias being introduced by virtue of a poorly worded or ambiguous question or a leading question. And this is, probably the error that most Americans are aware of, is how was the question asked? That will determine for me as to whether or not that question was a valid question. And that validity is also determined from the surveyor standpoint of how many times over the years you've asked that question. And so do we have a history that question kind of produces a reliable or good result, a result that we can at least say has decreased the amount of bias? Are you simply asking people their opinion, or are you leading them one way or another in that question? All right. Here's another question. Asking the right question. Comparison results from two versions of school choice questions. And this was asked way back in 2001. Question, version A. Do you favor or oppose allowing students and parents to choose a private school to attend at public expense? Okay, so do you favor or oppose allowing students and parents to choose a private school to attend at public expense? When you ask that version of the question, of course, no, not at public expense. 54% oppose that. When you ask the question, a proposal has been made that will allow parents to send their school-age children to any public, private, or church-related school they choose. For those parents choosing non-public schools, the government would pay all or part of the tuition. Would you favor or oppose this proposal in your state? That's reasonable to me. Why not quality non-public schools? Sure, 83% in favor. So the question itself can matter. And so this is yet another set of issues that we have to think through in asking and tapping into people's views. Now, in the end, let's do a segue to the next section, which is in what ways do attitudes affect voting? So we care about attitudes in a democratic republic, in a democracy. We care about what people think. But we care also about what they do based on what they think. How do they vote? How do they contact their members of Congress? How do they engage in politics in their communities? So behavior as a outcome of thinking. So comparison of voter turnout among select nations. And this is a segue to our next section. This was data across from the Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance. I believe this data is mid-2000. I'm sorry I didn't put the number on here, the date on here is mid-2000. But it is still pretty representative. I think actually it's 2008 if I'm not mistaken. It is still pretty representative of what has been true across a couple of decades when you compare the United States to various other democratic countries or Western countries, Western industrialized countries. So in Belgium, 93% of the folk turn out to vote. Iceland, 88%, Australia, 87%, Denmark, 87%, Italy, 87%, United States. Our high voter turnout in our most recent elections was 64%. Now, something's happening in Switzerland, so, Switzerland and India. So we can ask, we're not the bottom, but it is interesting that we consider 60%, or to flip it, 40% of people who are eligible to vote in national elections not voting as still being a really high turnout for us. Well, what's happening across the range of other democratic countries in the West that have a bearing upon their higher rates of turnout? And can we say that 60% of the population, that's a majority of eligible voters, but can you say that 60% reflects the views, here's a sampling error, right? It reflects the views of the entire country? They might. But it is something we should think through about democratic participation based upon this lower than norm turnout among Western nations. All right? And voter turnout in presidential and midterm House elections, 1932 to 2008. I'm going to come back to this sort of seesaw pattern. Yes, there are higher turnout rates in presidential elections than midterm turnout elections. We'll get back to that. But there has been a reversal decline in voting since 1960. And so we've seen actually increasing rates of voter turnout in recent elections, not necessarily in midterms, but in recent presidential elections. Why? Well, we'll think through that. All right, but that's a segue to the next section. In this section, I want you to think about the terms of public opinion, political ideology, political knowledge, political socialization, political generations, probability sampling, random digit dialing, sampling error, and measuring error. How is political knowledge a basis for public opinion and political ideology? How does political knowledge also relate to tolerance and participation? Explain why political trust has recently declined. Discuss some of the major divisions in public opinion according to the gender gap. What is the relationship between ideology, religion, and party identification? And how do the concepts of sampling bias, random bias, and push polls inform us as to whether a poll or survey is valid? By the way, it's a push poll if it is comprised of questions that are not validly asking people simply their opinion, but is trying to push their view one way or the other. A valid response to a question, a valid way to word a question may be, do you support or not support the right to an abortion? Okay, do you support or not support? A more biased way to ask that question would be, how much do you not support, or how much do you support the right to an abortion? It's presuming that people are leaning one way or the other. That's a push poll. Push polls are different than exit polls, which are the polls we take when people exit out of the voting booth to ask them a range of questions and exactly who they voted for. But this is after they voted, not before. Versus sort of the national public opinion polls we see and the exit and the tracking polls, which are polls that we ask across a range of periods within an election cycle. Okay, where do you stand now? Now, where do you stand now? Where do you stand now? How do we track where people stand across an election? Okay. All right, class. Well, this concludes this lecture. This is again from Dr. Todd Shaw. I'm at the University of South Carolina in the Department of Political Science, and all rights are reserved with regards to this lecture as intellectual property. Thank you much.